Hello, everyone. It's good to come to you. If I can't be there in person through this video lecture, and the next couple of video lectures as well. Today we're going to look at three different things. Today we're going to first of all start out by looking at what I call a roadmap to the field of ethics. And this roadmap is going to sort of explain where we're going to go for the first half of the semester. The second and third thing we'll do is we're going to look at two different ethical theories today, both falling under the heading of subjective ethics. We're going to look at individual relativism and we're going to look at cultural relativism, each in turn, and see some of the benefits and potential pitfalls of either of them. In order to look at the roadmap of ethics, what I call the roadmap of ethics, we are going to ask ourselves the question that you see on the screen here today, and that is, do universal moral principles exist? Because the entire field of ethics can be divided based on your answer to this question. This is the first major question that we come to in trying to delineate and evaluate moral systems. Is, do universal moral principles exist? Now, to be clear, what we mean by this is, are there moral principles that have applied to every person of every culture at every place in time in history? Is there one single moral principle that is applied to everyone universally? If the answer to that is yes, then basically you would be espousing an objective ethical system. But if your answer to that is no, there's no such thing as a moral principle that is applied to everybody of all times in all cultures, then you would be espousing a subjective system. And so, do universal moral principles exist? No or yes? If you answer no to that, like I said, you are espousing a subjective ethical system. If you answer yes to that, then you find yourself in the realm of objective ethics. Now, this is the first major division, right? And underneath each one of these categories, we're going to find a number of different views that we will study from now until midterm time. And that's what we're going to focus on from now until midterm time, is learning some of these systems, these and how they reason, things that they consider, so that as we get into the second half of the semester, where we will be looking at ethical issues, things that are more you're used to considering more, things like maybe abortion or discrimination or distribution of wealth, things like that we'll look at in the second half of the semester. We will have the artillery, or we'll have the processes down by which we can evaluate these various issues and see different sides of the arguments. So we will spend the first half looking at different views, and here's how we're going to do it. We're going to start first with looking at subjective ethics. So if you answer the question, do universal moral principles exist? If you answer that no, you're going to be on the subjective ethics side. Excuse me. And on that side, there are two basic views that we'll look at. The first is subjective relativism. Some people will call this also individual relativism, if you will. In individual relativism or subjective relativism is the view that ethics and morals are simply a matter of personal opinion. That what's good for you is good for you, and you can live that way. What's good for me is good for me, and I'll live that way. And I'm not right, and you're not right. We both there's equal merit to both of our views of right and wrong. But you're just going to live by the guidance of your own understanding. I'm going to live by mine. What's good for you is good for you. What's bad for me, or good for me, is good for me. Morals are a matter of personal opinion. That's individual relativism or subjective relativism. The next one that we'll look at is conventional relativism. Now, this view goes by a number of different names. It could be conventional relativism, depending on who you read. Conventional ethical relativism. It could just be, for short, conventionalism. And then also another name that it goes by is cultural relativism. That one probably is the easiest to remember it by, because basically what this view says is that morals come from a person's individual culture or society. That's where the morals come from. And so, whether something's wrong or right depends on what culture they live in. Is it wrong for a woman to go to the beach with a one-piece bathing suit? Well, in Victorian England, it may have been very wrong for that. It may have been considered immodest. Whereas if you went to, even at the same time in history, if you went to, for example, various tribal, maybe the South Pacific islands of the South Pacific, where it was very hot and humid on a regular basis, women wore very scantily clad, and it would not have been considered immodest in that particular area at that time. Morals are just simply a matter of cultural expression, and it doesn't go any higher than that. If you were to ask which one is better, Victorian England or the South Pacific Islands, what moral code was better, this view would say that neither of them are better. There's no way to judge between them. It's just that certain things are wrong over here that might be right over here, and that's the end of the story. But that's cultural relativism. So we'll see in subjective ethics, we'll see subjective relativism and cultural or conventional relativism. Now, if you answer yes, universal moral principles exist, then you find yourself on the other side of this roadmap, right? On the other side over here. If you answer yes to the questions, do universal moral principles exist, and understand that in order for you to end up on this side of the screen or this side of the column, that you only have to say that there's only one universal moral principle. There may be several relative principles or subjective principles, but as long as there's at least one universal moral principle, then you're going to find yourself in the category of objective ethics. These systems might have relative ethics going on. For example, different acts will be judged relative to a supreme moral principle. And so though they might be, say, in one context, for example, lying is good, in another context, lying is bad, that's not necessarily an example of subjectivity. Whether lying is good or bad might be judged in reference to an overarching moral principle, such as utilitarianism would say, do whatever provides the greatest good for the greatest number. So if lying provides the greatest good for the greatest number, then in that context, in that situation, lying is right because it's judged by that overarching moral principle, right? If lying is bad when lying doesn't produce the greatest good for the greatest number. Again, it's judged based on its relationship to that one universal moral principle. Always do what is in the best interest of the greatest majority, or the greatest good for the greatest number. So there can be some seemingly subjective elements on this side of the column, but as long as there's one universal moral principle to which all other principles and acts are judged, then you find yourself on this side of the screen. Excuse me. You find yourself in objective ethics. So with that in mind, do universal moral principles exist? Is there at least one? Is there at least one that you can think of? What might be the candidate, I wonder? What would be wrong in every culture? What would be wrong in every society that has ever existed? Well, some answers to that question are found in the views that we see below, these views right here. Consequentialist ethics, deontological ethics, and virtue ethics. Now, the first two of these, consequentialist ethics and deontological ethics, are actually sort of subcategories, because underneath each one of these, we're going to see two different views. So, for example, consequentialist ethics. These are ethical systems that judge the moral worth of an act based on the consequences that act produces. We're going to look at two different views that fall under that category. Both of them believe that the morality of an act can be judged based on the consequences. So, for example, the first one that we'll look at, is the view of egoism. And egoism has one overarching moral principle, and that is this. It says that One should always do whatever action produces the greatest benefit for themselves. One should always do whatever action provides or produces the greatest benefit for themselves. And so egoism the egoist says, I'm going to do what's in my best interest while you do what is in your best interest. That's what the egoist would say. And everybody can do what's in their own best interest, and where our interests overlap with one another, then we have the basis for a relationship. And it's a mutually beneficial relationship. I'm giving you something, in return I'm receiving something, but everybody's always acting in their own best interest. That's what the egoist would say, and that is the moral thing to do. Now, but again, think about what it's doing there. It's saying what action is going to produce the consequence of whatever's in my best interest. Again, it's judging on the basis of consequences. Now, there's another view, though, under this category, under the category of consequentialist ethics, that says, yes, that agrees that an act should be judged on the basis of the consequences, but it disagrees with egoism as to what consequences we're looking for. So the next consequentialist view that we'll look at is that called utilitarianism. Utilitarianism. And utilitarianism says this. It says one should always do whatever action produces the greatest good for the greatest number. We just talked about that a moment ago. One should always do whatever action produces the greatest good for the greatest number. So whatever action has the consequence of producing the greatest good for the greatest number, that's what we should do. And that's utilitarianism. It seems to be more of an altruistic or an others-oriented ethical system than egoism is. But nevertheless, both of them look at the consequences of the act to judge whether it's good or bad. Now, the next category or subcategory that we'll look at is that of deontological ethics. Deontological ethics. The word deontological comes from the Greek deon, which refers to one's duty or necessity. You must do this, right? So deontological ethics are ethical views that look at the nature of the act itself to determine whether it's good or bad. So, for example, whereas utilitarian ethics might say, is lying good or bad? Well, I don't know. Does it produce the greatest good for the greatest number? Deontological ethics might look at lying and say, lying is always good, or not always good. Lying is always bad, no matter what consequences it produces, no matter what effect it produces. It's always bad. And so regardless of the consequences, certain actions are always good and other actions are always bad. That's what deontological ethics would say. So we'll look at two different views of deontological ethics. The first of those, and they differ based on how they answer this question. They both agree that one should try to find out what the moral law requires of us. Okay? And so what actions should we perform? What actions should we refrain? Both of them agree that we should look at the act itself and what our duty or obligation is. Where they differ is in answer to the question, how do we know what our moral duty is? How do we know what the law demands of us? What are our moral obligations? How do we find that out? The first view that we'll look at answers that question like this. It's called intuitionism, and it says that the way that we find out what our moral duty or what our obligation is that we have a sort of sixth sense, a conscience or an intuition that tunes us into the moral nature of the universe, that sort of feeds us a non-rational, more or less emotive response as to the nature of good or bad. And we need to pay attention to that gut feeling. We need to pay attention to that intuition. We need to tune our intuition so that it properly receives, it properly understands what the moral law requires of us. And so we use intuition to do that. That's what one view would say. That's intuitionism. Now, so it's not a rational process that we go through. Rather, it's more of an intuitional. It's something that we feel this is good, or we feel this is right, or this is wrong. And I think that most of us can identify with that. I think maybe all of us at some point or time in our life have been about to do something and then thought for a moment, I just don't feel right about this. Maybe we couldn't explain why we didn't feel right about it, but something, a gut feeling that we had was crying out to us, this is wrong, this is wrong. You shouldn't be doing this. I don't know why. That's intuition. That's our intuition, they would say. And we need to pay attention to that because that's our sense picking up the moral nature of the universe to let us know what's right and wrong. Now, the other view that we'll look at under deontological ethics is that of Kantian deontological ethics. And those are named after the famous philosopher Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant was a very important philosopher of the later Enlightenment period. Well, maybe about the mid-Enlightenment. He was so influential, as a matter of fact, that everybody who came after Immanuel Kant had to, in some way, respond to him. So you find people who agree with him talking about how his theories are right and where they agree on. You find his critics formulating their theories in contrast to him, but all of them had to reckon with Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant he formulated a system of ethics in addition to all of his other philosophy. He formulates a theory of ethics known as Kantian deontological ethics, where he believes that we can use not our intuition to find out what the nature of the moral law is, but rather we can use our reason to determine what the nature of the moral law is. And it's that reason, we are rational creatures, we are rational beings, he would say, and it's that reason that allows us to know what's right and wrong. It's not intuition, it's not the feeling that we have. We're not looking at the consequences of the act. Rather, we're going to use our rational faculties to be able to tell what is good and bad. Now, think about that for just a minute. We'll emphasize this when we look at it more deeply later on in the semester. But think about what that means for just a minute. Kant believes that just like you can tell that 2 plus 2 equals 4, how do we know that? Well, we use our rational faculties to imagine 2 objects plus 2 objects, put them together, we have 4. We deduce that it's mathematically necessary that 2 plus 2 equals 4. If I were to say 2 plus 2 equals 5, you would tell me that I'm crazy. No matter how much I felt in my intuition that it was right, no matter how much I told you that my culture had brought me up to believe that 2 plus 2 equals 5, that wouldn't make any sense to you either. You would sort of laugh at that and say, well, you're wrong. And how do you know that I'm wrong? Because you use reason to demonstrate that I'm wrong, that I'm in error. Well, just like we can use reason to figure out problems in mathematics, Kant believes that we can also use reason to figure out problems in ethics. Now, what that entails is this, that when something is right, it's always right. And nobody should ever disagree on it. If we're using our rational faculties properly, then right is right, regardless of what you or I think about it. And all of us need to conform to that, rather than saying, well, it's my culture, or it's my intuition, or it's my opinion, or it's my feeling, or my desires. Kant says none of that. None of that matters. What matters is this. Is it rational? And we'll see how he figures that out and how he works with that. But understand that Kant is an absolutist. An absolutist in the sense that some things are absolutely wrong, other things are absolutely right, and that you can absolutely know which one is wrong and right 100% of the time. We'll see that when we get to Kant. He doesn't allow for a lot of gray areas in terms of morality or ethics. We'll see how he justifies that. It's an interesting view. We'll see that. Now, so we've got consequentialist ethics. We've got deontological ethics. Now, the last view that we'll look at here, the last category, is a view unto itself. And it's more of a catch-all view for various systems that they may be as widely different as some forms of pietism in the Christian tradition and Confucianism in the Eastern tradition would both both fall under this category to some degree. Worldviews as diverse and different as those, might find themselves falling under this virtue ethics. Virtue ethics refers to any system of ethics that focuses on character development rather than enumeration of moral principles. And so virtue ethics isn't going to ask for a list of laws, a thou shalt or thou shalt not. Virtue, like deontological ethics does. Virtue ethics is not going to ask you what the consequences of an act is, or this act or that act. It's not even really going to be focused on an act at all, whether it's good or bad or right or wrong. Virtue ethics wants to know, do you possess a virtuous character? And if not, how do you develop a virtuous character? And so virtue ethics is all about trying to identify what virtue is. And so is it virtuous, for example, to be honest? Is it virtuous to be courageous? Is it virtuous to be wise, and so forth? And as we identify virtues, virtue ethics is going to say what we need to do then is develop those virtues in our lives. Focus on the development of those virtues in our lives. And so we will see virtue ethics as we come to it. The view that we will be looking at, the specific view of virtue ethics, comes from Aristotle. And we'll see that. But understand that Aristotle's version of virtue ethics is not, by any stretch of the imagination, the only one out there. It's just probably one of the more famous ones, and probably the easiest to explain so that we can catch the idea. So then when we start looking at other virtue systems, maybe sometime in life, we'll recognize them for what they are. But virtue ethics concentrates, instead of concentrating on laws and on actions, rather it concentrates on character, whether a person's character is highly developed. And if you want to know what a moral act is, a person who believes in virtue ethics would say, well, a moral act is what a virtuous person would do in that situation. So not a lot of definite guidance like Kant would give, but nonetheless, the focus is different. It's on one's character and developing one's character. So that's where we're going to go for the remainder of the semester, the remainder of the first half of the semester until midterm. We're going to look at each one of these views in turn. We're going to see some of their benefits, some of their liabilities, and we'll go from there. And after midterm, we will take the principles that we learn here in evaluating actions and evaluating character and so forth. We're going to take that and apply it to different ethical issues that are out there. So hopefully, and as we work through that process, we will continually come back to these principles and stuff that we've learned in the first half. So anyhow, that's all for this particular video. We'll pick it up in the next video with focus on subjective relativism. Thank you very much.